Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Allison Bowden, TNC in Massachusetts Director of Conservation Science and Strategy, and your host for today. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally, using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have an exciting program for you today. We'll be chatting with Tricia Jedele, Atlantic Coast Offshore Wind Policy Manager at TNC. We'll be talking about the state of offshore wind in New England, how TNC is working to advance the siting of offshore wind turbines, and some of the rapid changes we can expect because of recent federal investments in offshore wind. Before we dive into today's program, I wanted to share a little bit about our guest. Tricia Jedele serves as the Atlantic Coast Offshore Wind Policy Manager, coordinating policy from Maine to South Carolina. Prior to joining TNC, Tricia worked for more than a decade as an attorney with the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office, most recently as the chief of the Energy and Environmental Unit. She was also a vice president at Conservation Law Foundation and the Rhode Island Advocacy Center director for 7 years. While at CLF, Tricia worked extensively with Rhode Island on the development of the Ocean Special Area Management Plan. Working as a private attorney, Tricia represented the Rhode Island commercial fishing industry and the Rhode Island Fisheries Advisory Board in mitigation discussions with Vineyard Wind in relation to the state's consistency review process. She earned a BA in political science from Providence College and a JD from Creighton University. As you think of questions for Tricia, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again so much for joining us today. Let's dive into the discussion. Hi, Tricia.
Hi, Allison.
Welcome. I'm so glad you've joined us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Can you start by telling us a little bit more about your background and how you became interested in offshore wind?
Sure. So, well, you've touched on it a little bit in the introduction. I've had somewhat of a unique opportunity to be able to look at offshore wind from all sides. So from molding a planning process from scratch to examining in detail the tools we use to buy energy and foster competition. And as you mentioned, lastly, to hearing the concerns of the commercial fishing industry and the developers while assisting with the compensation and mitigation discussions. So I've had a long time to sit with offshore wind and watch it evolve. I first became involved with offshore wind in 2006. So dating myself a little bit, I think that's 16 years ago. I was an attorney, as you mentioned, in the environmental unit, and the governor had announced that he wanted to increase the use of renewable energy to 20%, with wind energy making up about 15% of that. So shortly after that, he announced this RFP process, and people were very confused about what that was. And I was tasked by the Attorney General to do a couple of things: to look at the RFP, to make sure it was compliant with the law, and to try to get my arms around the planning process for the selection of a location for this 5 turbine project off the coast of Block Island. So, which later became known, some of the listeners may be familiar with the Ocean SAMP process. And so in those very early days, we knew kind of less than nothing. We didn't even know what we didn't know at that point. And I think a lot of people working on offshore wind at that time were feeling like we were standing on kind of a great starting line of something together, something that was going to become transformative in so many ways, not just energy buying, but the role of science, the concept of stakeholder engagement. And those were all areas that I was really interested in. And I wanted to be part of that transformative conversation, and I thought I could help with it. So that was kind of the story of where I was and how I got to be here, I guess.
Well, so with that, tell us a little bit about what day-to-day work looks like for you at TNC and why that was appealing. You have such a strong background, government and the private sector. What made you join us?
Yeah, so I guess before I talk about what I think this role is, or what the day-to-day looks like, let me start in on what attracted me to TNC. So this is a big job, and I'm still trying to figure out if my feet are big enough to fill the need and expectation shoes that were kind of created for this role.
Well, you don't have to do it alone, fortunately.
Exactly. This is a big, talented organization. So, but I suppose that in large part, it's also kind of what attracted me to the job in TNC. I like these challenges, and I saw this job posting and I thought, wow, like this is crazy big and visionary and kind of hopeful that an organization is really thinking at that level about how to engage in offshore wind, and sending the signal that they really understood what the success of offshore wind means to meeting climate mitigation goals and to all the work that they've been doing up to this point to protect and conserve biodiversity. So I think, for me, seeing that the Nature Conservancy really understood that, and that this was an organization that wanted to bring solutions to these big challenges, is what drew me to TNC. So what I do in the day-to-day, I mean, I haven't even been here quite a year yet, but I've spent a good chunk of my time learning about the work that we've been doing at TNC, talking to lots of people, experts inside and outside of TNC about what they think is important, what they think needs to happen to make offshore wind successful. And now I'm working really to design a coordinated approach for our work at TNC. Identify the right work for us so that we can further specific outcomes that help us to rapidly deploy offshore wind in the best way possible.
It is definitely a huge job, and we're so fortunate that you've joined us for that role. It's also kind of an amazing moment for opportunity, which leads me to my next question for you about how the Biden administration, the federal government, is investing in offshore wind and what that means for our region.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an exciting time, and certainly challenging, because with all this focus and direction on offshore wind, everything kind of speeds up, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But the Biden administration established this, I guess we call it like 30 by 30 target. So their target is to deploy 30 gigawatts or 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And this would put us on a path to be able to deploy 115 gigawatts by 2050. So the Biden administration has calculated that, this 30 gigawatts can offset or avoid roughly 80 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. But they've said, to get this, I guess they've really taken what I would say as a whole government approach. They understand that to get this done, we need new port upgrade investments. We need new US factories to make wind farm components like the blades and the towers and the foundations and the cables. We need a lot of steel. We're going to need 4 to 6, maybe more, of these specialized turbine installation vessels, one of which is being built in Texas right now by Dominion. Dominion Energy invested $500 million to build this specialized turbine installation vessel. And so, and I think, you know, the Biden administration is also recognizing what we're all coming to realize with offshore wind, that to bring this vast amount of power from offshore into the energy load centers where it's going to be required, we're going to need significant upgrades to our transmission system, which was not built for offshore wind. It was built, you know, to accommodate fossil fuel. So the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act of 2021, which the Biden administration supported and Congress passed, is going to direct significant funding into grid infrastructure, resiliency, supply chains, empowers different federal agencies to kind of make decisions that are supportive of renewable energy deployment. The Department of Energy is working on, at I think the direction of the Biden administration, a 2 to 3 year transmission planning study for offshore wind. And we, the Nature Conservancy, through the offshore wind program, are participating in that planning study. We're engaging with them on that work. So I think these investments, you know, when we take it back to the latter part of your question about how will this translate into jobs, how this will translate into benefits for our region, you know, we're looking at jobs, we're looking at opportunities to redesign our ports, infrastructure, thinking about infrastructure redesign more strategically, more resiliently, but most importantly, because I don't think we've even said this yet. I mean, I guess we did, but most importantly, it's major steps toward mitigating climate change and all of the effects that we're seeing on places and species that we care about, which is kind of front and center for us here in New England.
Yeah, well, given that our waters are warming faster than almost the rest of the planet, we definitely are seeing the impacts perhaps faster than others, those of us who like to, you know, who make a living in the ocean one way or another.
Absolutely, yeah.
So 2030 is just around the corner. If we're in the middle of 2022, it's like 7.5 years. That's a really ambitious agenda. Can you talk a little bit about where we are now? What's the state of the offshore wind industry in New England today?
Yeah, it's it's all a bit overwhelming, isn't it? I think there's a lot going on in New England and New York. So I'll start with what's currently underway. All the projects that are underway right now that are on track to being built and operational by 2030 are monopile projects. So driving fixed monopiles into the seafloor. The technology has really changed over time. We've started with like smaller wind turbines. Now we're getting up to like turbines that are the scale of 15 to 18 megawatts per turbine. Floating wind is going to be a newer technology that we're going to need due to water depth, which will be used primarily in the next phase of offshore wind development. Places like the West Coast are looking at this, the Gulf of Maine, and in the Central Atlantic, which is an area off of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, kind of near the shelf slope break. So it's really, you know, farther out there, at least 20 miles. There are 8 projects underway right now, offshore Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And I say 8 projects loosely because some of them are being completed in like multiple phases. So some projects will have like a phase 1 and a phase 2. And 3 of those 8 projects are proceeding in what is called the area of mutual interest, which was an area that was established between Massachusetts and Rhode Island as a place that would be appropriate for wind energy. They're all in various stages of, sorry, my Sarah Poodle here or something. They're all in various stages of environmental review and approval. And once they are fully operational, like I said, probably not until 2025, 27 for these 8 projects, they'll be producing somewhere between 8 and 10 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. The energy from these 8 projects is going to go to Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, with the largest chunks going to New York and Massachusetts. And that has a lot to do with how those states are positioning themselves to receive energy through legislation. And Maine, the Gulf of Maine states, including Massachusetts, are just beginning to explore wind. So actually, BOEM is holding a meeting right now as we're talking, the Intergovernmental Task Force on the Gulf of Maine, and setting out kind of its plan for the process for identifying wind energy areas in the Gulf of Maine. And as I said, that will have to be floating, which will be a new technology for us. So let's see, recently BOEM outlines like a strategy, which they've never done before, kind of a roadmap for its lease sales. They're going to proceed with up to 7 new offshore wind lease sales by 2025. They've already done that in the New York Bight. Some of the listeners may have been following that news. In February of 2022, they auctioned 6 lease areas in the New York Bight for $4.4 billion. And they just did a lease sale in the Carolina Long Bay. They'll do one in offshore California later this year. But they're also looking at the Gulf of Mexico, Oregon, and so on and so forth. So I think that is kind of the state of play in the region. And obviously there's lots more details that we can fill in on all of those projects.
There's a long way to go, isn't there? But it's great to hear that there's so much investment. There are a lot of people, I think you said there are a few hundred people on that webinar that's happening at the same time. So there's
exactly.
a lot of people working on this. So that's a reason to believe we might get there, which is great. So as an organization that's working globally to solve twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, we certainly talk a lot about siting. How do we do this in a way that actually solves the climate crisis without worsening the biodiversity crisis? Can you talk a little bit about the process for how that works and what kinds of information decision makers need to make good choices?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. Throwing the softballs at me, Allison. No, I'll take it. No, there's certainly a lot of concern around siting, and so I would like to take some time to talk about that. But let me just touch first on the process, because I think that feeds more easily into the siting conversation. I've already alluded to this in some of the answers, some of the discussion conversation we've had, but the process for the 8 projects I mentioned off of Massachusetts began for some of them in 2012 and 2013, and they are not yet operational. So I think it's important to let that sink in a bit. If we want to transition away from fossil fuels, we have to be committed to rapidly deploying offshore wind. But what we need rapid to mean in terms of mitigating climate change is not necessarily what rapid has meant in terms of the process for making offshore wind operational in the United States. So the process that BOEM set out, that kind of began way back when we were starting out in Rhode Island, has remained very much unchanged since about 2010. There have been little modifications and evolutions to the process over time, but it primarily looks like this. BOEM starts by drawing a large polygon on a map. The public and state resource managers and users, developers all comment on that large polygon. They express whether they have commercial interest in it or what types of data should be used to refine this mapped area, species of concern, user conflicts. And over time, with input from the adjacent states, stakeholders, other federal agencies, BOEM refines the area. And they kind of announce this winnowed down wind energy area that they then go into competitive leasing on. And so there's really a whole process around starting with that original polygon and getting it to this much more refined space where they're going to do leasing. And that area may actually become be further refined through the leasing process. Developers may win a lease, submit plans for surveying that lease area, and determine that there are portions, as a result of terrain or other issues that they're not going to use, or conflicts can come up kind of later in the conversation, and BOEM, working with the developer, can make modifications to how the lease area is used. So essentially what the developer does is they have to submit a, oh, I just saw that in the chat, sorry, I'm going into these acronyms. BOEM. BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Thanks for calling, whoever that was, thanks for calling me on that. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they are the federal agency that is charged with leasing. They manage the oil and gas program, and they also manage leasing in the outer continental shelf for offshore wind. And so they're in charge of the environmental review process and the leasing process for offshore wind. So once, and I'll just refer to them as BOEM throughout because it's easier for me. Once BOEM refines the wind energy area and they do the leasing and they award leases, a developer is given a certain amount of time to submit, they refer to them as SAPs. These are site assessment plans where they go in and they do bird and fish surveys, geophysical surveying, they install MET towers to get some more wind speed analysis. And all of those plans have to be reviewed. There's public comment on them. They have to be approved. And once they conduct the surveying site characterization activity, which usually takes place over the course of a couple of years, the developer then submits a construction and operation plan. And once BOEM determines that that's complete, they go out to public comment, they do environmental review on that plan, and simultaneously, all states right now, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, are also conducting separate reviews of these projects under their state coastal policy plans, and other federal agencies are conducting reviews. So think about Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the Navy, EPA, the National Marine Fisheries Service. There's probably a list of 20 federal and state agencies that are being consulted as these projects move forward. So finally, like we saw with recently with Vineyard Wind, 8 to 10 years after leasing, the construction operation plan is approved, and then the developer can actually begin to construct and move toward commercial operation. So sorry this is long-winded, but I think it's important to understand like how much process is actually there up front. But then now let's talk about, just for a second, let's talk about these siting challenges. I think there are, as I've thought about it, a couple of challenges associated with siting. And one of them I think is best described as regional readiness. I've heard this term used, and I've adopted it because I think it captures so much, in part, why, for me, why there are concerns about siting. there's so much to learn. There's so much information to digest when offshore wind comes to a new region. And when people don't feel like they understand why or how decisions are being made, they very naturally and very understandably default to a cautionary position that calls for more information, more time to process that information. And so I think it's really important to support federal and state agencies to make sure that these decisions about siting are transparent, and that conversations about siting begin very early on. They're kind of the key, that transparency and that upfront stakeholder engagement, I think, are really key underpinnings to regional readiness for offshore wind. But the other challenge, which is one that TNC as a science organization is very familiar with, is that we don't fully understand the impacts from offshore wind on the environment and ocean, because one, we don't have all the data that we need, and two, we don't really have any large scale projects that are being operated right now. So we are relying on developers to monitor effects, improvements, impacts. We're relying on developers in large part to gather information about specific areas that we don't have a lot of information about before they begin construction. And we also don't know absolutely that co-occurrence of a wind turbine. So just because we put a wind turbine in a space necessarily means negative impacts. So there may be net benefits from co-occurrence, and we don't know a lot about that yet. And there may be decisions we can make that can improve or maximize those benefits. So I think what this means in terms of siting is that we have to make sure we're using the best data available. We're identifying and funding research needs where we don't have data. We're actively engaging key stakeholders about use. We're identifying potential conflicts and those key stakeholders very early on in the process. And we most importantly, I think, setting the stage for learning and then adapting our approaches as we learn, because that's going to be a big, big part of our overall success, I think.
So there are so many players, and you mentioned a long list of government agencies and the different industry players. Maybe going back to what you do on a day-to-day basis in this role, or and how you work with some colleagues, where does TNC actually fit in this complicated ecosystem of trying to get these projects established in order to solve as a step towards solving the climate crisis and also protecting the ocean?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're continuing to work on, and that is really, I think, the reason for my position at the Nature Conservancy. But there are some obvious places, I think, that where there are kind of voids in what is happening in offshore wind. And one of those places is around this idea of looking for opportunities to maximize kind of net environmental benefit from co-occurrence, using data true to the Nature Conservancy's approach in the past to find solutions to some of these siting challenges. Because we're going to need so much of it, and because in the Northeast in particular, densely populated places where we're a lot more land constrained, we're a lot more resource constrained. Co-occurrence is something that will have to happen, and thinking more strategically about how we can maximize benefits from that is a place where I don't think there's a lot of focus and conversation right now. There's a lot of focus and conversation around using best available data to avoid siting impacts upfront, and deconflicting upfront, and the Nature Conservancy will continue to support that approach. but there are spaces where we need to develop more knowledge and more understanding as offshore wind moves forward. And I really see TNC as being a big player in that space.
Where does, in parts of the world where the industry is more established, where does data from that experience come in as far as application to our waters?
I think in some places it's transferable and in some places it isn't. So we're certainly looking at models. For example, some countries like Denmark are doing a lot of this co-benefit, identifying co-benefits from offshore winds. Like, can we address coastal resiliency in the design of the project? Can we address aquaculture or food security issues in the way that we're designing the project? And so I think there's some opportunity to look at what is being explored in those places and see if there's application here. But in some ways, it's very different. They don't have, their offshore wind is in much shallower water. They don't have the same species challenges that we have with North Atlantic right whales, dolphins. They don't have the same regulatory structure. So in some ways, I wouldn't say it's easier, but it's different. The way that they approach those challenges with the developers is different than the way those kinds of challenges have to be addressed inside this kind of federalist scheme that we're operating in, where the federal government's taking a role and the states are stakeholders and have important interests. So we are looking at that, and where it's transferable, we're trying to use that data and those scenarios and experiments, but it's not always 100% transferable.
Thank you. That's probably true of science in general. We have bodies of literature, and we look at all the evidence and think about gaps and how to fill those gaps. So it seems analogous to ways we work on other issues. So obviously the focus of this conversation is wind, but offshore wind exists in a context of a whole mix of energy. Can you talk a little bit about the role of offshore wind in particular in meeting climate targets?
Yeah, so I think, it's kind of a make or break decade, for us in a lot of ways. So what we do in the next couple of years, the stage that we set is really going to determine whether we're able to reach that global net zero emission goal by 2050, and more importantly, limit global warming of our planet to that 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So the European Commission, I think, has estimated like massive amounts of installed offshore wind power capacity are needed by 2050 to hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And I think by most accounts that I'm looking at, including from our clean energy policy experts inside TNC, we're going to need a lot more than what's in the pipeline if we hope to do that. So I think we're going to have to be addressing transmission, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit as part of meeting that challenge. And we also have a lot of state-driven objectives and goals that are moving offshore wind forward at the rate that it is.
Yeah, you touched on grid like the idea of grid modernization and some of the other infrastructure issues that need to happen. Can you set the stage for us a little bit more on what actually needs to happen, maybe broadly, to transition to renewables, and where offshore wind fits in that ecosystem.
Sure. So this it gets a little wonky here, and I'm not yet a transmission expert, but and I'll try to define acronyms if I use them, but I'll just start like high level. So each transmission line is designed to carry a certain amount of power. In New England, we have ISO New England, which is the New England Independent Energy System Operator, and they have this. They're the ones who make decisions about, how much energy from this source is part of our mix and how much is part of our mix. And they're really, their entire objective is not really around meeting climate goals, but is around keeping the lights on, keeping the heat on, system reliability for the region. And we're an interconnected region in New England. So they kind of govern those decisions. And they have what, I'll just start like at this point, they have what is called a loss of use rule. So it limits the maximum capacity of each line to 1,200 megawatts. So the idea being that any new energy coming onto the system can't have a risk of losing more than 1,200 megawatts at any given point in time. And that goes to this reliability thing. So they prevent reliability concerns. So they prevent lines with greater than 1,200 megawatt capacity. I think the other background thing that's important to know is that the grid in New England was largely designed to bring power from the center out. Out to Cape Cod. And there was not a lot of demand, going on Cape Cod. So the transmission lines, as we went from the center out to the Cape, got smaller and smaller the further out you went. So now we're in a situation where we're trying to bring massive amounts of power in from the Cape to where it's needed. And the capacity of those existing transmission lines is inadequate. So the first few offshore wind projects that have gone through are taking up almost all the electrical capacity that exists in the system. And
wow.
Projects like Mayflower and Vineyard Wind are competing for the last available space in the system. So in other words, there aren't any more places to plug in. We have to make those places. So even to get the space that exists, very expensive upgrades are required. Vineyard Wind spent $7 million in upgrades. Park City Wind, that Connecticut is tapping into, has to upgrade a few lines on the Cape to the tune of $200 million. So when we leave that burden and the costs of connecting on developers, that burden and cost gets passed on to ratepayers. So we have to become more strategic and collaborative as New England states in our approach to these upgrades. There are companies that are talking about, the concept of an ocean grid, building a meshed interconnected ocean grid so that we can use fewer lines, fewer cables from these projects, connect to the main shore, take up less, create less seafloor disturbance, increase reliability. And those conversations are starting to happen. They're the conversations that are taking place with the Department of Energy in that transmission planning study. But I think TNC, especially with their vast mapping experience, can add a lot of value to these conversations, particularly in the offshore environment. When we're looking at the right data layers, we're looking at the right information to look at to make sure that we're maximizing our ability to get offshore wind and minimizing impact to resources, conserved space, seafloor, that type of thing. I think we're going to be very well positioned to add value in those conversations.
There are a number of questions about sort of the regulatory process and the length of time and the complexity and sort of the number of different directions. You were just talking about the grid and the way that the grid was designed, the way that we have it now, and ocean governance is sort of different than land governance. So you were just talking about what I would say, what I think of as a longtime TNC employee, sort of a sweet spot for the Nature Conservancy is like the relationships and knowing the players. There are a bunch of questions about sort of streamlining. I'm trying to put a whole bunch of pieces together to come up with a question that I'm rambling a little bit, but
Okay.
looking at all the different things that people are asking, it seems like what do we think is the magic that actually makes these things come together? Like how does the mapping or the science help translate into like working through these layers of complexity? Does that question make sense?
How does the science help us work through these layers of complexity?
How do we use science to help us make things actually work, to get to the pace and scale that in your opening you were saying we really need to get to?
Yeah. So there's a big element of this, going back to that regional readiness concept. There's a public trust, there's a community buy-in, there's a components to the success of offshore wind. And there's a lot of need to not only get the right data in front of decision makers, but to translate that data in ways that actually improve the outcomes of decision making. So I think that, that is a place where the Nature Conservancy has experience both in supporting agencies directly in helping them identify what's missing in terms of data, or what the needs are in terms of research that we think could be, isn't research just for the sake of research, but is research that's needed to help improve the overall decision making. And I think that the Nature Conservancy has really been doing that in a lot of these places. We've been doing that with the Department of Energy and the transmission study. We've been doing that in these new announcements of potential wind energy areas off the Central Atlantic planning area. And I think the way that it becomes particularly impactful is that we have to understand that we're all kind of in it together. Like the federal agencies, the administration has set really bold and ambitious goals, and they're learning too. So they're very open to, as are the states, very open to expertise, past experience, and to creative ideas about and solutions for how to make the next phase better. And I think overall, that's just going to improve the confidence that people have in the approach that we're taking, and that it's actually going to do what we're saying it's going to do, which is it's going to offset reliance on fossil fuels. So I think I guess if I'm distilling I'm a bit rambling here in response to this question, but it's that we're being a good partner to federal agencies, state agencies, and stakeholders, where we share a similar, we have shared outcomes.
I think that's fair. I asked you a very complicated question meant to be kind of a synthesis of a bunch of more specific questions about basically how do we take a really complicated problem and actually find solutions that get it done. So there's a little bit different angle than what we've talked about so far. There's a question from Kevin Sloan about supply chain and workforce issues. To what extent do you see workforce as a challenge to build out and long-term sustainability in New England. And there's reference to workforce development money set aside for Carolina Long Bay lease sales. That's very specific. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
yes, 20%. Yeah. So that's a question from a listener who's really in the know. It sounds like.
I gathered, yes.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, but it's right on the nose. I think the administration is realizing, and developers are saying, that if we want this to become transformative in the sense that this is a U.S. owned energy industry, we have to build out the supply chain in the U.S. to get these projects built, and we have to invest in workforce development so that we have the skilled laborers that the companies need to get their projects built. And the BOEM is signaling, so the head of BOEM is signaling, as they did in the Carolina Long Bay lease, that they're committed to redirecting, up to 20% of the lease sale auction proceeds into supply chain build out. And again, the infrastructure bill, there's lots of opportunity in there to direct money into the supply chain needs. And I was just listening to Massachusetts talk in particular. They have like a $90 million port infrastructure fund. They just announced an additional $100 million to support port infrastructure upgrades for offshore wind, in particular at New Bedford, Salem, and Somerset ports. Or the governor, I think, just announced a supplemental budget of $100 million, and they're putting about $1.2 billion from the federal government into energy and environment infrastructure, training, development, innovation around offshore wind. And I think that you're going to see a lot of those investments happening in states that are angling for to become hubs, essentially, for offshore wind development. And I will just say here, because it's a good opportunity, that we don't talk about this a lot, but it's something I think about a lot as a former environmental prosecutor who worked on a lot of air pollution issues. There is an environmental justice component to layer to all of this, or there should be. So when we're thinking about re-envisioning our ports, to support offshore wind, we have to realize that a lot of times these ports have been highly industrialized locations that are co-located with people that are low income, people of color. And, for example, in the Port of Providence, it's the 4th highest asthma rate in the country. Tremendously high rates of early onset of childhood asthma, which we know is associated with diesel pollution and truck traffic. And so using these opportunities to redesign our ports in ways that are green, like the focus in New Jersey with Ørsted and Newark, where they're building a massive 200 truck electric vehicle charging station to support, to make sure that all the trucks that they're using coming into the port are green, that the vessels that they're using that are docking at the ports are green, and not using, they're basically, if you look at most ports, you're basically looking at like mini power plants that dock up to the side. They're unregulated. They don't have any like scrubbers. It's all fine particulate matter getting into the air, people breathing. So I think that in terms of job creation and workforce development, there are a lot of opportunities there that we should be looking at to do this better, to do it right this time around.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that just personally, I think that's so important. I grew up in East Providence, across the North Narragansett Bay from the Port of Providence, and 15 minutes west of Brayton Point in Somerset, which you mentioned as is being, there's a lot of investment in redevelopment as offshore wind. That was the dirtiest coal-fired power plant in New England for a long time. It was also a huge employer. And so the loss of that plant was better for the air, but lost a lot of jobs, lost a lot of tax base for Somerset. So actually seeing that get turned into something that is a climate and health solution is really exciting. So that there's a lot of benefits if we get it right, to put right some really significant past wrongs for how we produced energy in the past, and in many ways still do. So that a lot of exciting opportunity there.
Yeah, I agree.
So there's huge interest, and I apologize to the folks whose questions we're not going to get to, but I do want to make sure that I ask the question. We have such engaged folks on the phone. How can people stay up to date on what's happening in this really complicated arena? And is there a way that they can be advocates for some of these policies?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would do, if you haven't done it and you're really interested in just getting caught up to speed, BOEM does have a renewable energy tab on its homepage, and you can look at the status of renewable energy activities by state. It's not always up to date, but they actually do a decent job with it. So it's a good place to look state by state to see the projects. I think I saw in the chat someone asked what other projects. You can go right on that web page, go to the Massachusetts, on the map, pick Massachusetts, and it will list all the projects, and it will tell you what all the stages of all the projects are. They also have recorded versions of all of their public hearings. So like that intergovernmental task force that's going on today is recorded and will be and is accessible. And they have some great resources that explain the process and explain why they have to move the way that they do. So I think that's a good, it's not a one-stop shopping place, but it's a good, convenience store for some of the information. You will also find that your coastal agencies are really tracking this because of the role that they play in evaluating these offshore wind projects. So your Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Agency, the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council will have information on their web pages about these projects that will be more from the state perspective. So that's a good place to look for it as well. And you can also go to the developers' websites. But in terms of the best way to advocate for better policies, there's just so many ways to do this that I think can be meaningful to you. If you try to think about what's meaningful to you as an individual, as an advocate, attending, public hearings, offering public comment, more broadly, calling for appropriate funding to support BOEM in this huge effort. It's a small agency that's being asked to do a lot, to call for support for research and monitoring and identifying research priorities, and also to call for this, to call for the New England states to collaborate, to work collaboratively with each other on these big challenges like transmission and maximizing benefits from offshore wind. That to me is really an interesting piece when you think about the Sunrise Wind Project, which is and South Fork, which have caused so much controversy off the coast of Rhode Island. That's power going into New York by cable. So these projects are sited in, off the coast of Maine or off the coast of Rhode Island, but they're not limited to that geography. We can, you know, the transmission cables now are quite, you know, hundreds of miles long. You can get to other places. So there really needs to be regional collaboration about what their priorities are and what matters to regional ocean users. And I would say to continue to advocate for that.
Excellent. Well, we're approaching the end of our time. Unfortunately, this has been such a fun conversation. Do you have any final thoughts or hopes you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, I guess I would say, you know, my greatest hope is that we get it built in time to turn back the clock on climate change, and that we come to see this as something we co-own as part of the fabric of our communities, a testament to our resilience, our independence, our determination as New Englanders to do it. And that at the end of the day, we're seeing, you know, we're earning the dividends of that investment. We're seeing meaningful environmental benefits that were strategically and thoughtfully incorporated into these projects from the very beginning. And I think we need to, you know, we need to be brave about it, because it's a big transition that needs to happen, a big transformation, and it is scary, and there is a lot we don't know, but we know one thing: we need to do it. So great.
That is an excellent way to wrap up. We need to be brave. Well, I very much enjoyed talking with you today. Thanks so much for taking time out of the BOA meeting to join us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. So we'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying this webinar series, please share the links with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. Our next webinar is a week from today, Thursday, May 26th at noontime. We'll be chatting with Andy Finton, TNC in Massachusetts conservation ecologist, and Eve Schluter, Mass Wildlife's Assistant Director of the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, about a new tool called Biomap 3 that will give conservation decision makers the tools they need to protect lands that are most critical for staving off biodiversity loss. You won't want to miss this, so sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Allison. This was great.